Never happen in Syria. That's what panelists on this show predicted after the 2011 fall of Tunisia's Ben Ali and Egypt's Mubarak. Turn out those panelists were right. The groundswell started in the central city of Daraa 10 years ago this Monday, but Bashar al-Assad is still in power. A civil disobedience became a civil war, and a civil war became a proxy war with jihadists and foreign mercenaries pouncing on power vacuums. Assad stayed. Instead, it's ordinary citizens who got up and left. With more than half the population either in exile or displaced, what are their prospects? How much of a win is it for a leader who only controls, as you can see from this map, an estimated 60% of his own territory and who's beholden to foreign backers? As the Syrian pound tumbles and a new cash crisis cripples the nation even further, what lessons learned? What prospects going forward? Today in the France 24 debate, we're wondering what future for Syria. Joining us is Syrian filmmaker Mulham Abu Kheir. Thank you for being with us here on France 24.
Thank you.
I want to welcome from Lausanne academic Joseph Daher, the author of Syria After the Uprisings, The Political Economy of State Resilience. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
From London,
good evening.
Jasmine El Gamal, former Middle East advisor at the U.S. Defense Department. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
And always a pleasure to see Régis Le Sommier, associate editor-in-chief of French news weekly Paris Match. How are you?
I'm very good, Francois. How are you?
Not so bad. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. What does today's Syria look like? Well, polarized as much as ever. France 24's James Andre visited refugees over the border in the Lebanese city of Tripoli.
Al-Taqwa is one of the two mosques that were targeted in a double car bomb attack on the 23rd of August 2013 in Tripoli. 53 people died and dozens were injured in the Sunni stronghold of northern Lebanon. Azam had come to the mosque that day for Friday prayer.
I was sitting right here. We were thrown to the ground. Those sitting behind came crashing onto me. I saw horrible things outside. People trying to pull burnt bodies out of the rubble. There were dead people everywhere, some impossible to recognize. People were in shock.
Lebanese courts declared the Syrian Secret Service responsible for the attacks. At the time, Imam Rafai was openly criticizing the regime and urging worshippers to take an active part in the opposition.
We asked our state to at least designate as terrorists the regime that ordered, planned, and executed the attack. They refused, and they accuse us of being terrorists. How can we heal our wounds? It has been 10 years now. Those who planned and executed the attack are still on the run.
The investigation proved that the attacks had been coordinated by 2 Syrian officers and carried out by a 5-member cell operating out of Jabal Moseh, Tripoli's Alawite pro-Assad neighborhood. Back then, violent clashes had broken out between this quarter and nearby Sunni districts. Taleb and his friends took part in the fighting.
Here at Jabal Moseh, we have one president, President Bashar. We are proud of him. This wall was the front line. The fighting was crazy. Grenades would fall here, at our feet.
In 2014, the Lebanese army enforced a ceasefire that holds to this day.
They fooled us. I lost my brother, he died a martyr. I lost a lot of friends on this street. They used us.
The violence has stopped. The main problem now is unemployment.
I'm an Alawite Muslim. She is a Sunni Muslim. I married her 25 years ago, and we live in perfect harmony. It's like paradise. Times are hard. The pound is in free fall, and there's no work.
This is the kitchen. And that's the room. I sold the stove to buy medicine and food. I have sold our beds and the sofa. I have nothing left.
10 years ago, the Syrian conflict invited itself on these streets brutally. Today, the fighting has stopped, and both factions, the Sunnis and the Alawites, are obsessed by the same question: finding enough money to feed their children.
And James Andre joins us live now from Beirut. James, you get the sense that in 2021, 10 years on, it's a stalemate.
Well, in a sense, it is. What's for sure is that indeed it has damaged the sectarian, it has increased the sectarian tensions here on the Lebanese side of the border. That's for sure. And as you saw in that report, there was some violent fighting, but still today, nobody's forgotten that Hezbollah, which is the Shia party here leading the southern part of Lebanon, and obviously it is present at the parliament, and leading that parliament, has been sending fighters across the border into Syria to prop up Assad's regime. And then in the northern part of the country, it was Sunnis that were also going to fight alongside opposition militia. So yes, of course, it has opened a rift politically here in the country, or reopened it. Of course, it was always there. But the sense is that, of course, Hezbollah will tell you that they won, that they've managed to keep Assad in power, which was the objective. As you know, the party is aligned with Iranian interests. But on the other hand, critics say that this is not a real victory, because there were heavy losses in the ranks of Hezbollah fighters, also because 1.5 Sunni Muslims have moved into Lebanon. These are the refugees that were part of the opposition, and they have settled down here, of course, for the time being. They're refugees. Objective, they should be going home, but that does mean that there is a demographic shift in some parts of Lebanon, and that is something that is closely monitored not only by Hezbollah, but also by Christian parties here, some of which are very critical of this influx of new population. So yes, it has divided the country here in Lebanon, and it has had a heavy impact.
All right, James Andre, many thanks for that report from Tripoli and that update. I want to begin by turning to you, Mulham Abu Khair. You heard James Andre describe that stalemate and describe how Assad can claim to be the winner, albeit at a cost.
Yes. To be honest, like the situation in Syria now is a tragedy. Every Syrian I know, starting from my family, my sisters who live in Syria, and I speak to them every day, everybody like have a trauma from this ongoing war. The current situation is really bad, comparing to the first 9 years of this revolution. Something, and now the last year, maybe because of the COVID-19 accelerated the poverty rate.
But you saw that little microcosm, right, in that report, which is the positions are just as entrenched as they were in 2011. If you're people either are for or against, and there's no changing anybody's mind.
No, and I think the situation will still like this, because the root of the problem it still exists. This revolution started for reasons like the dignity, the freedom of speech. Like now, the situation is worse. Even we wanted to have a better future, maybe not for ourselves, but for our children. I think the situation now, the generation who born and raised during this 10 years, the situation is like, I think now is really worse than 10 years ago.
Are you sorry that there was an uprising?
No, I think it's a price we paid, and it's the cost. Now I think that we have to look to the future. We should not leave everything we paid till now gone for nothing.
Joseph Daher, is it possible to look to the future?
Well, it is sure that the situation is very catastrophic today in the case of Syria. You see the GDP has plumped from 60 billion to 21 billion from 2010 to 2020. The total accumulated loss during the conflict is over 530 billion USD. The overall poverty rate in Syria is over 90%, with 60% of population suffering from food insecurity. The inflation is booming every year. The cost of living is exploding. So definitely the situation in Syria is very, very difficult. The roots for the uprising are still here. Lack of economic development, unemployment, and the dictatorship is still here. And even worse in many aspects, the patrimonialization of the regime increased even more. The concentration of power within the presidential palace has increased in the past decade. So how do we look to the future? Also, there are lessons to be learned. I think there's been a political experience of accumulation. People learn some of the mistakes. And until today, what we can say is that the Syrian regime is lacking stability. There's deep socioeconomic problems, various forms of protest, even in areas that are considered as loyalist. With all, I think we should be careful with this kind of characteristic. Just I would be challenging maybe only a sectarian understanding of the consequences of the Syrian uprising in Lebanon. For example, you were showing Bab al-Tabane, Jebel Mahsen, Tripoli. We should know that during the Lebanese uprising in 2019, these two neighborhoods came together and challenged the whole sectarian ruling class, just as the Lebanese protesters challenged the racist discourse in Lebanon, putting the blame on Syrians for the socioeconomic crisis.
And they're saying there's a bit of a spillover effect of events in Lebanon right now. The Economist reporting this week that many oligarchs in Damascus are not able to put their money in Lebanese banks, and that partially explains the tough economic times that are felt inside of Syria.
No, definitely the Lebanese financial crisis had consequences for the Syrian economy, especially that according to various studies, even though we should be careful, there's between 20 billion to 40 billion US dollars in Lebanese banks from Syrian citizens, but some of this money has been prior to the war in Syria, prior to the uprising in 2011. The first reasons for the socio-economic crisis in Syria are the reasons because of the war, the destruction caused massively by the Assad regime and its allies, Russia and Iran, and also the political economic orientation of the regime, deepening neoliberal policies in the past decade, which impoverished the people. And obviously, a last element that we have to take into account is the sanctions that are also playing a negative role for large sectors of the population, while businessmen affiliated to the regime can overcome the consequences of the sanction. But these are the whole reason why we're seeing this catastrophic socioeconomic situation in Syria.
Yeah, the Associated Press reports from Damascus this Monday how medicines, baby milk, diapers can hardly be found as the country faces its bleakest economic outlook since the start of the uprising. And as food prices skyrocket, the currency has crashed, now at 4,000 Syrian pounds to the dollars. Here you see the graph for food prices, and 4,000 Syrian pounds to the dollar. This is on the black market, compared to 700 a year ago and 47 at the beginning of the conflict in 2011. Jasmine El Gamal, the current cash crunch seems to be putting the economic woes of previous times during the past decade in the shade.
Absolutely. I mean, this is just such a tragic situation that 10 years on, the problems in Syria just become more and more compounded. And you're seeing the effects of the pandemic, the effects of, 10 years of war, refugee crises, one humanitarian crisis after the other. I mean, all of these things are really coming to a head right now and really taking their toll on the Syrian population. And as your previous guests have explained, it's making it really hard for people not just to rebuild, but to survive. And how do you even rebuild? How do you start putting your life back together? How do you start focusing on things like psychosocial support and schooling and health when you can barely put food on the table for your children? So this is unfortunately where Syria is 10 years on. And it's why I think it is incredibly important for outside countries that do have the ability to mitigate some of these circumstances, like the UK, like the US, like France and Germany and wealthy Arab countries, it is imperative that they don't look the other way, that they don't get tired of talking or thinking about the Syria crisis, despite the difficulties that all of the countries that I just mentioned are going through themselves. It's incredibly important for us to look at Syria, recognize the absolute tragic situation that has befallen the Syrian people because of this crisis, and to actually continue to find ways to do something to alleviate their pain and their suffering 10 years on.
Régis Le Sommier, you agree there is a responsibility in the West?
There's a responsibility in the West and on the part of many countries ever since the beginning of the war. Actually, there was some hope created, and that was never fulfilled, and all the promises of the West were never fulfilled. But I wanted to go back to the international situation. I think there's one term that has been said by one of your panel guests, was the term sanctions. I think the sanctions are adding misery to misery right now. Because there is no political situation, or because the political situation or the political outcome of the war, meaning the victory of Bashar al-Assad and his allies, or his control on, let's say, 2/3 of the country right now, is not accepted by the West, by the Americans or by the French even. There is no, that blocks totally any form of humanitarian help. We were talking about the prices going up, the consequences of COVID. I was in Syria in November 1 year ago. I had the chance to visit the former rebel neighborhood outside Damascus of the Ghouta, and Ghouta hasn't changed. But I thought Ghouta is an ocean of misery even today. Places like
Régis, I want to pick
Ghouta.
up on this with you, because we have to take a very quick break, but we will pick up on this point of whether or not sanctions are the way. When we come back, you're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We've been throwing the spotlight at France 24 on 10 years since the start of the uprising in Syria and the brutal stalemate that has ensued. We're talking about it with Syrian filmmaker Mulham Abou-Khair, who joins us here. You arrived in France in 2014.
Yes.
From
Beirut.
From Beirut, via Beirut. You left to complete your studies here, and you've stayed on ever since.
Exactly, 7 years.
From Lausanne, academic Joseph Daher, the author of Syria After the Uprisings, The Political Economy of State Resilience. From London, Jasmine El-Gamal, former Middle East advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense. And here in Paris, we are joined by Associate Editor-in-Chief of the French news weekly Paris Match, Régis Le Sommier. Régis, you were telling us just before the break how the fact that the West is isolating Assad is making it worse, you say, for the general population?
Well, it's making it certainly worse for the overall population, and especially I was mentioning things that I've witnessed in Syria about a year ago. If you take just to take one example, is the very symbolic city of Homs, which was once nicknamed the capital of the rebel capital of Syria. Well, when you go throughout the downtown of Homs, the fighting has stopped in September 2014, and ever since nothing has changed. So nothing has improved. It's rebels, and the problem is, on top of that, you add sanctions. You had another batch of sanctions created by the Caesar Act and voted by the U.S. Congress, which makes it almost impossible for any companies to deal or to strike deal or to make business inside Syria. And right now, everything is at a stalemate, right? But even the government allies like Russia and China are not really investing. I mean, Russia is not really investing. China is weighing on whether to invest on a very unstable population situation. Sorry, the only thing that could come out of and would be from the Gulf state, and we know that about 2 years ago, the EAU decided to reopen their embassy in Damascus. So that was one of the first signs that maybe some business could start with the Gulf countries, but nothing has really been done so far. So everything has been an addition of misery, and every bit of sanction that is added on the Syrian government is making it worse for the whole country.
Yeah, but what do you do if you're Emmanuel Macron? Do you say we're lifting the sanctions? That won't fly.
No, I know, but the question is who is targeted by the sanction? The people from the government, and who is in fact suffering the most from them is the overall population. Whether they are in the north, whether they are in Kurds. I mean, the Kurds area might be a little better off, but the rest of the country is not gaining anything. So it's a situation where you're really leaving Syria and what can come out of it? More misery and more fighting at one point, because there's going to be so this knot that is being tied around Syria is something really unbearable, and who are the victims of that? The most humble people, the people who cannot, who are already suffering from the war, who are already displaced. Let's not forget that we talk about the refugees outside Syria, but you have about 5 to 6 million inside Syria that are refugees. Right now, you have 1 Syrian out of 2 that is not living in his home. So it's a situation that is already very bad, and all what the international community is doing is trying to change the political system in Syria by applying more and more sanction, and obviously this is not working.
Jasmine El Gamal, do you agree that it's time to stop rooting for regime change and maybe ease the sanctions so that the general population will suffer less?
Thank you, Francois. I'll tell you something. I feel very strongly when I am asked that question that it is not my place to say whether or not the West should be pursuing regime change in Syria. I very much feel like that's something for the Syrian people to decide and to say. But I will take your second question about the sanctions. I want to point out a couple of things that I think are really important when we talk about the debate about sanctions. It's really important to understand that first of all, most of the sanctions that are targeted against Syrian officials are actually asset freezes and travel bans around the regime and its cronies who have been benefiting the most from access to banks and the international banking system, and none of that money is trickling down to the Syrian people. So actually sanctioning those figures doesn't affect the Syrian people at large. There's an academic here in London. His name is Dr. Hyde, who has written about how the Syrian regime has weaponized humanitarian assistance that goes through it, and how it uses it actually to its own gains, and how it doesn't trickle down to the average Syrian person living under regime control. I've written about this for the Cairo Review of Global Affairs, detailing how any construction money, any humanitarian assistance that goes to the Syrian regime is actually used to remake the state in the image of Bashar al-Assad, making it harder for refugees to come back to their homes. People are being bulldozed out of their neighborhoods, and new construction deals are being given to the regime's cronies to benefit the regime loyalists. So I think that, the topic of sanctions is quite complicated, because on one hand, of course, you don't want to do anything that would increase the suffering of average Syrians. But on the other hand, it's important also to know that much of the money and the assistance that is being poured into Syria through the regime is actually benefiting the regime and its loyalists. So I think the challenge for the international community, whether individual countries or international organizations, is to find ways to funnel that assistance directly to the Syrian people and to local organizations that are benefiting the Syrian people.
Let me ask you concretely on that, because last few days we've seen several reports about Syria's First Lady, Asma al-Assad, saying that the UN, if it wants to send money in for humanitarian purposes, it's got to do it through her and her charities. So what do you do if you're the United Nations?
Exactly, Francois. I mean, that's kind of, they're caught between a rock and a hard place. The United Nations gets a lot of flack for their actions or for their decisions in Syria, because they do have to make that decision. Do we just not give any assistance at all? Or do we give it where we can so that hopefully it trickles down to at least some people? I think the decision that the UN has made is that, you know, it's better to try to reach somebody than nobody. But it is a position they never should have had to be in the first place. And that is on the Syrian regime. It's on the president and his wife and, you know, and his loyalists and all of the people that are trying to weaponize humanitarian assistance and economic assistance. It's cruel and it's inhumane. And I don't think that that the UN has much choice in the matter. Again, it's not for me to say whether it's the right thing to do or not, but I do understand that the decision that they've made is to try to help some people rather than no one at all.
Joseph Dyer, is there a third way when it comes to helping ordinary citizens?
First, let me come back on an issue that it's not true that there was any kind of plan for regime change in Syria. Let's make things very clear. This has never been a plan of Western countries or Western states. At best, there was a change of Bashar al-Assad for another general or someone close to the regime. But the biggest lesson of the catastrophic occupation of Iraq was never to put an end to its state and structure. On the opposite, Barack Obama concentrated on the so-called war on terror, ISIS, but never wanted to challenge the regime per se or to change it. So this is something to make very clear, because it has been ongoing that there's been a willingness of the Western states to regime change. This is not true. And quite recently, actually, we've seen Gulf monarchies also change their position towards Syria, with Mohammed bin Salman saying quite clearly 2 years ago that his problem is not with Bashar al-Assad, but with of him being an Iranian puppet. Secondly, I think we cannot deny, and it's very true, that the sanctions, that the regime has instrumentalized humanitarian assistance and has favored NGOs, or so what we used to call gongos, so NGOs in the hands of businessmen or regime loyalists. This is certainly true. But at the same time, NGOs in Syria are affected by the sanctions, by the chilling effect, by the over-compliance by the financial system, the financial institutions, to transfer money to Syria. Today, half of the NGOs in Damascus are having problems to reach their money, to have transfer towards Syria. This are affecting the programs on the ground, humanitarian assistance on the ground. One NGO in the past year had to diminish by 70 to 80% its number of employees because it wasn't able anymore to reach the money from its bank abroad. So this is very well documented. Just as in France, for example, NGOs working on Syria, or Syrian NGOs or French Syrian NGOs, had seen their bank account closed by French banking system because of the fear to fall under the sanctions. This is undeniable and has been widely documented.
It's been widely documented. So what do you do now? Because again, is it which one is it? Are you arguing for the lifting of sanctions?
No. What I argue for is, and definitely the debate is not between no sanctions or all sanctions. Obviously, I'm refusing any kind of normalization with a regime that has committed crimes against humanity. And it's very well that in Europe we're seeing increasingly judicial and tribunal raising actions against this regime. We've seen, for example, after decades, Omar al-Bashir, former dictator of Sudan, being made, most probably will be judged. And this is very good. And hopefully the same thing will happen with officials of the Assad regime. At the same time, I don't think, and throughout history, we never seen a regime change its political position because of sanctions. This has never happened. Look at Iran, look at Cuba, and other cases. Therefore, we should show a bit of flexibility, I think, and effectively reassess the sanctions that are affecting the vast majority of the population that I remind are living 90% of them under the poverty line. And this is where I think we should reassess the general mechanism of sanctions on this aspect. And I think this is very, very much important.
Free movement of money. We're also seeing how policies have changed. Mullam Abu Khair, when it comes to free movement of people. You say that you came here in 2014. There was one of those seminal moments of this past decade which happened a year later, and that was when Germany opened its borders for a short while, and a lot of Syrian refugees went to Germany, a lot of the best and the brightest, right? People like yourself, who are here in the West now and no longer in Syria.
I think we were talking about the sanctions, and we were talking about how at the end, like the Syrian people suffer from this. So I'm not debating the sanctions, yes or not. I'm talking about this opportunity to give the new generation, the next generation, the Syrian youth, the people who are suffering from 10 years.
So my question is,
yes.
Do you have a special responsibility, you feel, as somebody who is now from the diaspora, or would you consider yourself as being in exile?
Yeah, sure.
And do you have a special responsibility in terms of Syria? Like, what should be the role of Syrians who are in exile right now?
This is exactly what I was about to say. I think now we have to help these Syrians who are stuck in Lebanon and the refugee camps inside Syria. These people, they deserve a brighter future. They deserve education opportunities. They deserve maybe scholarships for higher education. They deserve a better maybe job opportunities to support themselves and support their families. So these people who I can consider the future of Syria, that we are seeing maybe cities destroyed, but I think the most important is the people who are really destroyed inside them. You know, these people, they don't have even hope. So what's most important for me as a Syrian at the end, I want these people to everything we fought for to have a result one day.
So drawing from your personal experience, what can you say to them to give them hope from what you've experienced yourself?
I think they should like to dream about a better future, to keep dreaming, to keep this dignity and this hunger for freedom. At the same time, education, following your dream. One day, I think we're not the only people who suffered from a civil war or a revolution, but we have to see maybe the Lebanese, for example. They had like 30 years civil war, but like now, how successful they are in Europe. So for me, I want this Syrian who, both the Syrians who left and the Syrians who still inside, to have a brighter future.
It's incredible, Régis Le Sommier, because we had reports earlier from our team in the refugee camps, including the huge one that's across the border in Jordan. And, you know, there are children who are 8, 9, 10 years old who've only lived in those camps. And you heard there, Moham, talking about the importance of education. What do you do to stop it from being a lost generation?
Well, that's the biggest outcome. I mean, the most tragic outcome probably of this war would be this whole generation of children being left without going to school. When you talked about the siege of Aleppo, for instance, I remember seeing women saying their kids didn't go to school at all for 4 years. And you know, right now, all over Syria, I mean, you have these big camps, you know, almost like a town that once used to be like the 4th biggest town of Jordan. You have one there, and then you have a lot of them in the north as well. This is really a very worrying situation. But I would like to talk. I mean, to go linger a little bit on the fact that what could, if we look at the future, if you look at what could be good for Syria, of course, that a new generation, new leaders come maybe from the exile community or from within Syria, because there is the biggest problem Syria has. One of the biggest problems Syria has today is when you talk about the victory of Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian regime being, in place after 10 years of war, is what is the credibility of the opposition today? The opposition controls, only the northwest corner of Syria in the region of Idlib. And what do you find in Idlib? You find the main group who controls the area, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is led by its leader, former jihadist, Jolani, and these people are trying, they are trying to sugarcoat their movement by saying they're credible. We've seen recently an interview by Frontline, an American journalist from Frontline, interviewing Jolani, and Jolani, for once, not wearing his jihadist outfit, but a jacket, trying to look more acceptable by the West, because that's what they're trying to do. Well, personally, I don't think that the future of Syria comes with these people. And I think the future of Syria has to come from, more educated or more, international minded. And if there's a possibility of reconciliation, then somewhere along the line, there should be, a form of reconciliation, because, Syria is divided in two. You have the Syrians that are outside Syria and the Syrians that are inside Syria. And if you want some form of reconciliation, at one point you have to let these two talk, or to form. I know it might sound very naive, but the opposition has to be more credible, and right now it's not credible at all.
Jasmine El-Kamal, you agree?
Yeah, I think the idea of how credible the Syrian opposition is or was has always been a sticking point for the West and for Syrians themselves that I've talked to over the years. I mean, from the very beginning of the conflict, when it was, whether it was, it started as a revolution, and then you had members of the Syrian army itself leave and start opposition units, and then you had the Free Syrian Army, and then you had jihadist movements, and then you had the international sort of exile group, people that were living in Paris or other countries, and everybody was kind of trying to stake a claim to be the credible, quote unquote, credible Syrian opposition. At the end of the day, I think that we are where we are today, and of course, the UN Special Envoy's office should continue their efforts at reconciliation. We should continue to support reconciliation where we can. But I almost think that that's not really even where the priority should be right now. I'm thinking about Syrian children who are so traumatized that they can't even absorb any sort of education that's provided to them because they're so traumatized. I'm thinking about women who've lost husbands and men who've lost families or who've lost friends. I mean, the trauma, the absolute utter trauma that the Syrian people have been through for the last 10 years is so debilitating that I think that it has to be the first priority when we address any kind of assistance that should come from the outside. And like one of your guests said, half of the Syrian population is displaced, whether internally or externally. There are Syrians who are living outside the control of the regime that we can reach with psychosocial services. There are refugees outside of Syria that we can do the same with. And so I think, really getting down to that core problem, something that we can actually do something about, which is address the trauma, and then you can rebuild on that. But as long as there's trauma, it will be very hard for people to rebuild their lives and have any sort of a future that they can look forward to.
All right, Jasmine El-Gamal, that'll be the final word for now. I want to thank you so much for joining us from London. I want to thank Joseph Daher in Lausanne, Switzerland, Régis Le Sommier, Mulham Aboukeir. Best of luck to you with your film projects. I want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.